For the first time in over 2.5 years, Ukraine is fighting Russia on Russian territory rather than its own. This is big, and it could change everything. A massive red line has been crossed, and Putin now has to face up to the possibility of further encroachment as a war that he started has not only come to his country's doorstep, but has barged through the door and is wrecking the sitting room. On August 6, 2024, Ukraine broke through the shabby Russian front lines, guarding the country's Kursk region, and launched an invasion of its own. The rules of engagement have changed. But what actually happened? How has Ukraine's invasion into Russian territory progressed since it began? How is Russia responding? And most importantly, is this the beginning of the end of Putin's war? Our military experts are here to talk about it today. We start with what we know so far. Initial reports of Ukraine's invasion scrambled to find information. The Guardian, one of the UK's leading newspapers, was among the first to offer details, noting that a report from a Russian military blogger claimed that Ukraine had broken through Russian defenses and was now up to 9 miles into the Kursk region and advancing further forward. That initial report, which came a day after Ukraine launched its invasion, also noted that Russia claimed to have launched an immediate response. The military blogger being quoted said that Russia had used a combination of aerial and missile strikes, along with artillery fire, to inflict around 260 casualties on the Ukrainian forces, while also taking out 50 of their armored vehicles. How true those claims were is yet to be verified. Even if they were true, the Russian strikes seemed to do little to slow down the advancing Ukrainian forces. Le Monde, a French news website, followed up with a report of its own on August 8th, in which it provided more details about the Ukrainian forces that entered Kursk. It noted that around several hundred Ukrainian soldiers had made the border crossing, bringing with them at least 10 tanks and around 20 armored vehicles to launch bombardments on several small towns in Kursk. Sudza was a key target. It was struck with missiles and drone attacks that resulted in at least 5 deaths, more than 30 injuries, and a state of emergency being declared that forced its citizens to evacuate. Le Monde also says that the initial incursion of a few hundred may have just been the start, as over 2,000 Ukrainian troops had amassed on their side of the border before the attack was launched. The French news site echoed The Guardian's claims that Ukraine had gotten up to 9 miles deep into Russian territory, while adding further details. Ukraine's invasion had resulted in it gaining control of around 20 villages, along with the Sudza gas station. The latter represents a major coup for Ukraine. The Sudza gas station is used by Russia to transport natural gas to the rest of Europe. By taking control over that station and the pipelines that feed into it and away from it, Ukraine makes it extremely difficult for Russia to continue doing business with other European countries. Furthermore, given that the station sends gas to Ukraine, it may even be able to partially control the flow of precious resources into its own territory. From about this point, it became clear that Ukraine's invasion wasn't a mere smash and grab. Rather than briefly entering Russia to wreak some havoc before retreating behind the border, Ukraine was taking territory and advancing with a remarkably small contingent of soldiers to send Putin a message. We can enter your territory and wage war just as you have against us. Live trackers started cropping up, with Sky News launching one of the most detailed. From August 9th, it had reported on Ukraine's actions and the impact they're having. Interestingly, that day saw an underreported secondary assault by Ukraine on Russian territory, as a massive drone attack occurred in the Lipetsk region of Russia that disrupted power supplies, caused explosions, and wounded 9 people. A reinforcement of the Ukrainian message that it's now happy to attack Russia inside Russia, perhaps. August 9th also brought news of further advancements. The Institute for the Study of War said it had geolocated footage showing Ukraine may have advanced as far as 21.7 miles into Kursk, as well as offering some insight into the tactics the Ukrainian forces were using. The several hundred that crossed the border had divided into small armored groups, which would bypass Russian fortifications and engage soldiers directly before withdrawing. Rather than consolidating control through these advances, the armored groups would then move on to other fortifications. Thus, Ukraine is sowing confusion among the Russian ranks. The small groups attack and then leave, moving on to the next target. That leads to reports among Russian soldiers in the region that it has to deal with these smaller groups, only then to be blindsided by larger Ukrainian groups that move in, consolidate positions, and hold them. It's an effective disorientation tactic that's causing Russia's collected forces to spread out while they're being harassed and assaulted by the other groups. It was also on this day that the first accusations of Western involvement started to fly. A senior Kremlin official claimed that the UK had been involved in Ukraine's incursion. A member of the State Duma, Adalbi Shagashev, said, "Britain participated in all such sorties. English was heard." There is no official confirmation of this, with the claim likely building on Britain permitting Ukraine to use the weapons UK supplies in Russian territory back in May 2024. Again, it's extremely unlikely that British soldiers are working with Ukraine in Russia, though the claims reinforce the state of confusion Ukraine has managed to create with such attacks. More images started to emerge from the incursion. These included pictures of a decimated convoy of Russian armored vehicles, with the monitoring group Deep State claiming that Ukraine had destroyed 13 of the vehicles in a strike. All the while, Russia's defense ministry claimed that it was continuing to repel the Ukrainian advance, even as it became clear that Ukraine was driving deeper into Kursk. On August 11th, official acknowledgement of the incursion came from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. For the first 5 days of the assault, he had been tight-lipped, likely fielding calls from Ukraine's Western partners, inquiring about the invasion and its purpose. He may also have kept quiet to gauge the response, both from the international community and Russia itself. Finally, he seemed to confirm his approval of the incursion, stating, "Ukraine is proving that it can indeed restore justice and ensure the necessary pressure on the aggressor." A reason for the Ukrainian invasion made clear: it allows Ukraine to heap pressure on Russia and may potentially give it more bargaining power at the negotiating table in the future. August 11th also saw more Ukrainian attacks. Russia claimed to have shot down 14 Ukrainian drones, along with 4 Tochka-U ballistic missiles over the Kursk region. But Russia didn't achieve a shutout. Officials in Kursk claimed the strikes injured 13 people after a Ukrainian missile struck a 9-story building. The day also brought news that Belarus was sending troops to the border it shares with Ukraine, likely as a deterrent to ensure Ukraine doesn't get any ideas about launching a similar invasion into the territory of one of Russia's key allies. Reports also started circulating in Ukrainian media that the country's forces had entered the Belgorod region. Located to the north of Kharkiv, a Ukrainian region that has seen intense fighting since mid-2024, Belgorod would represent Ukraine expanding its invasion to include several Russian regions. A video of 5 Ukrainian soldiers emerged, all standing outside a building in Belgorod, who delivered the following message: "I wish you health. The 252nd Battalion is in the village of Poroz, Belgorod Oblast. Glory to Ukraine." The village is 25 miles from the Ukrainian border, though it's still unclear exactly when this video was filmed or if it was shot as part of the Kursk invasion. Either way, it's damaging propaganda aimed at Russia, showcasing that Ukraine has the ability to attack multiple targets on Russian soil simultaneously. This news was followed by more reports later in the day, which claimed that 4 people were injured in the shelling of a small town in Belgorod. The Ukrainian invasion was expanding. By this point, Russia's response had switched to one of indignation. Its defense ministry hit out at the Kursk invasion, labeling it barbaric and claiming that it served no militaristic purpose. Of course, this response ignores the fact that the same could be said of Putin's special military operation, which has led to Russia controlling around 38,600 square miles of Ukrainian territory. The Russian Red Cross also started evacuating people from the Kursk region, with the organization claiming that it had received 3,000 calls in less than a day following Ukraine's incursion. Russia also imposed what it called a counter-terror operation in the border regions of Kursk, Bryansk, and Belgorod, and there are no real details about what this operation entails. Zelensky rounded out the day by further justifying Ukraine's invasion. "Artillery, mortars, drones," he said. "We also record missile strikes, and each strike deserves a fair response," Zelensky said when explaining why Ukraine had launched an attack on Kursk. All told, Zelensky claims, the region was responsible for almost 2,000 cross-border strikes against Ukraine during the summer. But perhaps the biggest news to come out of August 11th was that Ukraine appeared to be sending even more troops into Kursk. Sky News reported that up to 6,000 Ukrainian soldiers may have crossed the border, dividing their attention between Kursk and Belgorod, which implies that Russian attempts to reinforce defenses at the broken front line had failed and that Ukraine was making a concerted effort to take and retain Russian territory. Come August 12th, and the invasion was still ongoing. Russia started to evacuate more regions, following up on those in Kursk, with more evacuations in Belgorod. It was unclear just how widespread the evacuation was, though word of it came from the region's leader, Vyacheslav Gladkov. These evacuations could also be seen as confirmation of the footage mentioned earlier, and that Ukraine was widening its invasion of Russia to include more than just Kursk. Belgorod was also placed under a missile alert, again suggesting that a Ukrainian assault was imminent if it wasn't already taking place. Later in the day, it was confirmed that 11,000 people had been removed from the Krasnoyarsky district of Belgorod. More drone attacks had taken place overnight, with Russia claiming to have shot down 11 drones over Kursk and 5 more over Belgorod. Reports didn't confirm whether any of those drones had managed to reach their targets before being destroyed. More rhetoric emerged, with Putin claiming that Russia needs to dislodge the Ukrainian invaders, while Russian state TV showed footage of Kursk residents fleeing their homes and receiving first aid. As is so often the case, Russia had started using the invasion to create propaganda, with it being likely that Putin was using this opportunity to further cast Ukraine as the villain while attempting to cement his position as leader. Other claims, such as those made by Kursk governor Alexei Smirnov, emerged, with Smirnov stating that Ukraine had used chemical weapons during its invasion. Those claims haven't been independently verified. So where does all of this leave us? Ukraine's initial invasion of Kursk has evolved from a small operation involving several hundred soldiers to an all-out assault that might include as many as 6,000 Ukrainians crossing the border. Ukraine now controls dozens of villages in Kursk, along with the important Sudza gas station, and it's forced evacuations and declarations of states of emergency throughout the region. Worse yet for Russia, it's clear that Ukraine isn't going to stop at Kursk. The last couple of days have seen it launch attacks in Belgorod, and it's likely that Ukraine has already taken territory in that region as well. Russia's defenses have crumbled under the invasion, with fortifications failing to hold up, Russian soldiers surrendering en masse, more on that later, and a complete failure to send any viable response. The lack of response has only allowed Ukraine to roam deeper into Kursk, meaning Russia continues to lose territory. We come to another question. What does Ukraine's Kursk invasion mean for Putin and for the future of the war? Starting with Putin, there's only one thing that can be said. He's been humiliated by Ukraine's actions. For almost his entire leadership, Putin has attempted to cast himself as a strongman. That's vital in Russian politics, as the country has always preferred a strongman leader, who portrays themselves as somebody capable of preserving the Russian Federation. Putin's image has taken a severe knock due to the Ukraine war. Not only has he failed to take Ukraine after 2 years of fighting, exposing the outdated tactics Russia's army uses in the process, but he has allowed another country to invade Russia. Yes, he's trying to use that invasion to cast Ukraine as the bad guys in the special military operation, but he's doing that out of desperation because he's now the strongman who buckled at a key point in Russia's history. The Kursk invasion marks the first time that Russian territory has been occupied since World War II. Back then, the threat came from a massive German military that had already run roughshod over the rest of Europe. Ukraine's invasion is far different. It's a much smaller nation, less than a third of Russia's size. And yet it's not only managed to break through the front lines to get into Russia, but it's actively capturing territory and advancing. More than 100,000 Russians have been forced to flee their homes, according to ABC News, a fact which again rattles Putin's reputation. Those 100,000 people, whatever their opinions on the war may have been, should have been able to rely on Putin to keep them safe. Now their confidence in their leader will be shaken as they face potentially losing their homes in an invasion that they likely believe never should have happened. Of course, Putin has come out with more of the threats he's levied since the beginning of the war. On August 12th, he claimed that Ukraine was trying to undermine Russian stability with the invasion and that its actions would be met with a worthy response. Exactly what that response would be and why it's taking so long to formulate wasn't covered. Troops have been deployed, claimed the country's defense ministry, with heavy tracked vehicles being sent to Kursk to create blockades. But again, Ukraine continues to advance, and buoyed by its success in Kursk, it's also invading other border regions in Russia, with Putin seeming to be able to do little to stop them. Yet more humiliation. War has come home to Russia. On August 13th, around 200 displaced Kursk residents arrived in Moscow, which sits about 326 miles from Kursk. Moscow is now home to 400 temporary accommodation centers, which have been rapidly created to house up to 30,000 displaced residents. An admirable internal response, perhaps, but yet another humiliation for Putin. The war was never supposed to go this far. Ukraine absolutely shouldn't have made its way into Russia, and certainly shouldn't have had enough of an impact to force Russians to flee their homes. Putin's humiliation doesn't end there. In addition to being forced into a position where he has to try and explain away the fact that Ukraine has successfully invaded Kursk, he also faces a dire situation within his own military. Russian soldiers have apparently surrendered en masse to Ukraine rather than stand their ground. Some of the first reports of these surrenders came on August 8th, when the New Voice of Ukraine reported on footage and images released on social media platforms that appeared to show Russian troops captured by Ukraine. The video that came with these reports appears to show up to 40 unarmed Russian soldiers, all holding white flags as they're hurried along a highway that leads to Ukraine. Those are 40 Russian soldiers who were supposed to stand and fight. Soldiers who had fortified locations in Kursk were supposed to defend the region's villages. It would be one thing if these soldiers fought to the death. Putin could at least claim they gave everything to defend their fellow countrymen. But the fact that they've surrendered so quickly exposes Russia's military as being incapable of handling a small invading force that initially numbered only a few hundred people and at best is now up to 6,000. Yet another humiliation for Putin. More reports of Russian soldiers surrendering followed. August 12th, the Euromaidan press was claiming that Ukraine had caught Russia so severely off guard that the 40 Russian soldiers shown in the previously mentioned social media footage was just the start. Just 6 days into the invasion, Ukraine had apparently captured an estimated total of 300 Russians in Kursk, all of whom surrendered rather than choosing to fight against the enemy. Those surrenders have likely played a large role in Ukraine's success in Kursk so far. It holds almost 24 villages and a gas station, and it continues to march forward. That wouldn't have happened if these villages were properly fortified and Russian soldiers stuck around to fight. So not only does Putin have to deal with the perception that he's filling the Russian army with cowards who won't fight on their territory, but he also has to deal with the humiliation that comes with being underprepared. Russia wasn't ready for the invasion. Putin's arrogance led him to believe it would never happen. So Ukraine's incursion into Kursk has brought Russia's leader down to earth with a bang, again damaging his reputation both domestically and internationally. And there may be even more than 300 surrenders. On the same day that Euromaidan Press set the number at around 300, UA Wire claimed that the number could be as high as 1,000. It mentioned a new video showing Russian soldiers being loaded onto a Ukrainian Ural truck, while noting that Ukraine's military personnel didn't expect such a high number of captures. The surrenders have come so quickly, UA Wire suggests, that they're causing logistical problems for the soldiers tasked with escorting the Russian captives back to Ukraine. That's a terrible look for Putin if true. To have so many of your soldiers surrender that you catch your enemy by surprise with just how little resistance you put up makes Russia's entire military look weak. Ukraine expected a proper resistance and instead has been met with surrenders, a far cry from Russia's claims to have taken out hundreds of the invading Ukrainians already. So we see an invasion that should never have happened and the mass surrender of Russian soldiers indicating a military presence inside Russia that's nowhere near strong enough to deal with the encroaching threat. Both are massive humiliations for Putin. But perhaps the biggest humiliation comes from what Ukraine's invasion of Kursk represents: the crossing of the last major red line. Since the beginning of the Ukraine war, the concept of red lines has been prominent. These lines are actions that many in the West believed might provoke Russia into intensifying its invasion or, in the worst case, expand it to include more of Europe. Supplying Ukraine with weapons was one of these red lines, which is why the early weeks of the war saw many Western nations providing non-lethal equipment as support before it became clear that Ukraine would need more. Allowing Ukraine to use these weapons it receives from the West in Russian territory was another red line. It's also one that's been crossed multiple times in 2024, with backing from the UK, the Baltic states, and even the US. The latter of those nations, which was clearly the most hesitant to approve the use of its weapons in Russia, permitted Ukraine to use them near the Kharkiv region several months ago. Red line after red line has been crossed. Yet the actual invasion of Russia appeared to be the red line that would stay in place. That's no longer the case. According to the Atlantic Council and its analysis of the Ukrainian invasion, the encroachment into Kursk represents the collapsing of the final red line that Russia had in place. Worse yet for Putin, the fact that the invasion was successful and has been met with so little resistance has made a mockery of the West's fear that an attack on Russian soil would lead to further escalation. It hasn't. Instead, all we've seen is Putin, somewhat toothlessly, claiming that Russia will repel the invaders while he decries the West for helping Ukraine. There has been no nuclear escalation. Russia hasn't even managed to put up a strong defense against the Ukrainian invasion. Instead, it appears to not know exactly how to respond as Ukrainian forces get deeper into its territory. Russian morale has been damaged. This is obvious from the sheer number of Russian soldiers that have surrendered to the Ukrainian forces. Panic is also spreading throughout Russia, made worse by the declarations of states of emergency and widespread evacuations. Add to this the emerging invasion of Belgorod, and Ukraine is creating an atmosphere in which it's clear that it'll keep pushing, leaving many in Russia to wonder if its soldiers will reach their homes. The entire dynamic of the Ukraine war has changed. And yet the crossing of this final red line showcases a pattern that's been present from the start of the war. As the Atlantic Council points out, Putin threatened a nuclear reply if Ukraine attempted to retake the occupied city of Kherson during the war's first year. "I'm not bluffing," he claimed, only to completely fail to follow up with the nuclear strikes when Ukraine retook Kherson just weeks after he made the threat. Therein lies the pattern: nuclear threats against Ukraine. Threats of retaliation against Sweden and Finland for joining NATO. Threats against the UK for allowing Ukraine to use the weapons it provides in Russia. All have been made, many times over, and yet none have been followed up. Red lines have been crossed constantly, and Putin has simply carried on his invasion with no extra action. That lack of follow-through in his threats has allowed the entire war's dynamic to change. Not only is Putin now dealing with the fact that his special military operation is taking far longer and has cost far more than he anticipated, but he now has to fight a war that involves Ukraine invading Russian territory. The momentum is now with Ukraine, as according to Sean Bell, Sky News military analyst and a former fighter pilot who told Al Jazeera that Ukraine has managed to seize the initiative as part of its invasion. He notes that the Ukrainian invasion caught everybody off guard, and it forced Russia to change its tactics. Troops were withdrawn from the front line of the Donetsk region and redeployed in Kursk, apparently unsuccessfully given that Ukraine continues to advance. Ukrainian morale has been boosted, even if Russia manages to push its soldiers back. And if Ukraine manages to keep the territory it's captured, it now has a powerful bargaining chip to bring to the table in future negotiations with Russia. Perhaps Kursk could be traded for part of Donetsk or Mariupol, both regions in which Russia has taken large swathes of Ukrainian territory. In short, Russia is no longer in control over the direction the war is taking. Whether that loss of control is temporary or signals a new direction for the war is yet to be seen. But once again, Putin finds himself humiliated as the momentum shifts out of his favor and forces him into a position where he has to respond to the type of aggression he's displayed throughout the Ukraine war. Things are made even worse for Russia by the global response to the attack. In the West, there appears to be indifference, at least in terms of the possibility of the invasion leading to a response against the West. Putin again tries to blame the West, claiming on August 12th that it's clear that the West is fighting us with the hands of Ukrainians. Another threat, however veiled, has amounted to nothing. Putin hasn't responded. Ukraine's Western allies haven't amassed to tell Zelensky that he needs to withdraw his soldiers lest Russia expand the war. The West has essentially let Ukraine do whatever it feels is necessary, with the only real hint of a Western response coming from the White House. The US contacted Ukrainian military leadership to ask about the objectives of the incursion, but it certainly didn't tell Ukraine to stop. If anything, the response was more curious than worried, far from what Putin had hoped to inspire with his threats. Putin can't even rely upon China to unequivocally come to his aid. On August 12th, the Chinese Foreign Ministry called on all parties to make efforts to de-escalate the situation. They should make these efforts on what Beijing calls the 3 principles for de-escalation: no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no fueling the flame. China outlined those principles just weeks after Russia first invaded Ukraine, with this later reminder being non-committal. While it comes in response to Ukraine's incursion, it could just as easily be argued that China is sending a message to Russia to de-escalate on its own end. That's far from the support Putin would have hoped to receive. And when combined with the lack of a fear response in the Western world, even more humiliation comes Putin's way. Europe is treating him like a tiger who has lost his teeth. We finish with a final question: what comes next? The latest from the Kursk invasion at the time of the writing of this script is that Ukraine is claiming to have seized 28 settlements, with its soldiers occupying about 390 square miles of Russian territory in Kursk. That's according to one of Ukraine's top military commanders, Alexander Syrsky, who provided a video brief to Zelensky that was later uploaded to the Ukrainian president's Telegram channel. "We continue to conduct an offensive operation in the Kursk region," said Syrsky. "Currently, we control about 1,000 square kilometers, equivalent to about 390 miles, of the territory of the Russian Federation." "We continue to conduct" are the key words here. Regardless of how Russia responds to the invasion, Ukraine has already scored a major victory, and it's going to keep pushing to claim more Russian territory. It's crossed the final red line, with no nuclear response in sight from Russia, and it's redefined the rules of engagement for the war while leaving Putin with egg on his face. Russian soldiers are surrendering en masse. Putin is making pitiful claims that the invasion is a humanitarian catastrophe while trying to divert attention away from what he's doing in Ukraine. And it finally appears that the most powerful strongman in Russian politics has a few chinks in his armor. Chinks that could cause him serious problems, domestically and on the global stage, for many years to come. But what do you think about the Kursk invasion? Will Ukraine manage to keep funneling soldiers into Russia, enabling it to maintain the territory it's captured? Or will Russia's eventual response lead to Putin reclaiming what Russia has lost? What does the invasion mean for the future of the war? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.